Hi guys. So you may have been a little confused when you saw this week and saw that we were doing body horror and vengeance together. Hopefully you've already looked at the PowerPoint on kind of the basics of body horror to get, your kind of basic familiarity with that. And they don't really necessarily seem like the same thing because they're not. Body horror, of course, is this type of horror that involves the violation of the human body, either through forcing it to become something else or, doing things to it without its consent. Vengeance can involve body horror. People can seek vengeance due to body horror. That's actually fairly common. Vengeance can involve body horror. We can seek vengeance through these violations of the human body, but they're not necessarily the same thing. And so you might have been wondering, well, why do these on the same week? A lot of times the stories, they do come together. People seek vengeance more often due to body horror than other kinds of violations. And part of that is just because our body is the one thing that we always have. If you come after me and you come after my property, for example, property can be replaced. For example, you steal from me, I can replace that money. You break up a relationship, I can repair that relationship or I can get a new relationship. But if you come after my actual body, particularly in a way that will be permanent, that's not something that I can just fix. I can't regrow limbs. And even if it's not a permanent injury to me, that mental trauma is forever. Our body is the one thing that we carry with us our entire lives. And anybody who's ever been injured in such a way to have experienced something that you might consider body horror, you know that there are many people who would say that is a fate worse than death. So, yeah, I think that there are a lot of people who've experienced such a thing would say that that does demand vengeance. Demand, of course, being a term there that is up for, I guess, argument. But you do see the two concepts intertwined in literature quite a lot because there's kind of a line in the sand with body horror where a lot of people will say that is the kind of last line that can be crossed. There's a reason that body horror is the kind of horror that is most often banned. You'll see a lot of other kinds of horror or just, violence, for example, that is allowed, but body horror is the kind that is most often banned. So we're going to talk about several stories that involve these concepts. We're going to start with Berenice, the post story Berenice. It's more purely body horror. It doesn't really get into vengeance, but we're going to move more into vengeance stories. And incidentally, Berenice is one of Poe's most widely controversial stories. You read a lot of Poe stories. You might have read, for example, Casca of Amontillado in your comp 2. You might have read The Telltale Heart. You might have read any number of Poe stories that are quite violent, that involve murder and things like this. And people are kind of okay with that. But you read this story, this very short story, that really is about a man who's just in love. And he's in love to the point that he can't deal with it when the woman he's in love with passes. This is the one that when it was published, people wrote tons and tons of hate mail to the newspaper in which it was published. They could not believe this story made it past the censors. And it's not a story about murder. It's not a story about violence in the traditional sense, but it is a story about body horror. So if we look at Berenice, obviously it sucks that we're not in the classroom and I can't just ask you, what did you think? Which is what I would normally do at this point. But we'll start with this epigraph. So hopefully you have your text with you. We start with here in the English kind of text of it is, my companions told me I might lighten my misery by visiting my dear one's grave. Which, well, that's a pleasant thought if you haven't read the story and don't know what he does when he gets to his dear one's grave. It's also a more pleasant thought if you don't know that his dear one was still alive when she was buried. And being buried alive is a pretty common trope in Poe. You see it a lot. We actually saw it a little bit in The Black Cat, but he does that a lot. And that in and of itself doesn't constitute body horror. Being buried alive is it's an element of claustrophobia. It's an element of some kind of other fears, but they don't constitute body horror because in and of itself, that is not a violation of the physical body. But where the violation of the physical body occurs in the tale of Berenice is when he digs her body back up and pulls out all her teeth while she's still alive. So let's go to the end of this story. Sorry, my pages are pretty stiff. It's one of those kind of fancy bound copies, but so I'm going to just flip to kind of the end section. I found myself again sitting in the library and again sitting there alone. It seemed that I had newly awakened from a confused and exciting dream. Well, guys, this concept that he is doing things in his sleep that he is not aware of is also not in and of itself body horror. It's terrifying to think that you can do things that you are not aware of doing, and that does constitute something that you see a lot in horror. People who maybe are drugged, who are under the influence of, for example, chemicals or poisons or magic or something along those lines. You're going to see it often, and that does feel like a violation, and it can reach into the realm of body horror. This idea that you are taken over, particularly if it's kind of like an invasion, a body invasion, body snatchers, some sort of possession that can cross into the line of body horror. But in this case, it doesn't quite get there, because it's more just that he's dissociating. It's very close. He said, I knew that it was now midnight, and I was well aware that since the setting of the sun, Berenice had been interred. So she's been buried. He knows that. And he knows that he's had it done quickly. But of the dreary period which had intervened, I had no positive, at least no definite comprehension. But its memory was rife with horror. Horror more horrible from being vague, and terror more terrible from ambiguity. It was a fearful page in the record of my existence, written all over with dim and hideous and unintelligible recollections. Now, let's say that you are the audience and that you are reading this story at home, first time ever, you're this Praetorian person, and you get to this passage and you say, okay, it's more horrible because I couldn't remember it. What would you think as the audience? You're expecting a horror story, and you're not told any of the horror that happens. You're just told something bad happened, and I kind of vaguely remember it, but only enough to know that it was bad. How would you feel? Would you wonder, was it so bad that I blocked it out of my memories? Would you wonder, was I making it up? And again, it gets to true body horror, in the truest sense of the word, when we start to think of things like invasions, possessions, things like that. We don't really know what happened here. I tend to think of there's this old Saturday Night Live sketch, David Pumpkins, where there's kind of a bad joke in it where they say the true horror of the mind is the unknown. That's kind of what we're getting at here. But then he goes on and he says, but I knew I had done something. So it's not just something had been done that was bad. It's like I knew I had done it. So again, it's that capability inside us of evil, that moral monster that we talked about. What was it? And he saw this little box. It was a box of no remarkable character, and I had seen it frequently before, it being the property of the family physician. But how it came there upon my table, and why did I shudder in regarding it? These things were in no manner to be accounted for, and my eyes at length dropped to the open pages of a book and to a sentence underscored therein. The words were singular, but simple words of a poet. And then we have back the epigraph from the beginning about going to the grave of your beloved. Why then did the hairs of my head erect themselves on end, and the blood of my body congeal within their veins? Now, if you had remembered that was the epigraph, you might think back, oh crap, he's gone and done something at the grave of Berenice. And then if you look back, he told of a wild cry heard in the silence of the night, of the gathering together of the household, of a search in the direction of the sound, and then his tones grew thrillingly distinct as he whispered me of a violated grave. Well, we know whose grave it is, right? His beloved. Of a disfigured body discovered upon its margin, a body enshrouded, yet still breathing, still palpitating, still alive. Well, that's bad enough to begin with. That you have this violation, that is absolutely body horror. The idea that you could be buried alive, And it's not just that you're buried alive, but it's that you're buried alive by people who should have known better. They knew she had catalepsy. They knew that she had this physical ailment that made her look as though she were dead. And the rushed burial suggests that, yes, they knew there is a very good chance she was still alive. Because think about how quickly in this story they buried her. And the suggestion that he's blocked out that he's gone to her grave and done this deed suggests, again, that our narrator knew the entire time what he was doing. It's these suggestions between the lines that make this story so truly horrifying. And it's horrifying for Berenice, not for a narrator. And that's a little bit different than a lot of Poe stories. We're used to the terror in a Poe story being a terror for the narrator. And in this, it's not. It's truly a terror for Berenice, a woman who has been buried alive by the person who claimed to love her, and a person who probably knew what he was doing. But then it gets worse. It gets still worse. Even though we have that horror hanging on our heads, it still somehow manages to get worse. He pointed to my garments. They were muddy and clotted with gore. So muddy, okay, we get it. You dug her up. But the gore part. I spoke not, and he took me gently by the hand, but it was indented with the impress of human nails. He directed my attention to some object against the wall. I looked at it for some minutes. It was a spade. With a shriek, I bounded to the table and grasped the ebony box that lay upon it. But I could not force it open, and in my tremor, it slipped out of my hands and fell heavily and burst into pieces. And from it, with a rattling sound, there rolled out some instruments of dental surgery, intermingled with many white and glistening substances that were scattered to and fro about the floor. That's the end. That's how the story ends. It doesn't even specify it's her teeth, but of course, because we know it's dental instruments, we are to assume that they're talking about teeth. Now, what a terrifying and horrific way to end that. That this person presumably had this woman buried alive, knowingly, for the sheer purpose of weakening her or killing her so that he could then dig her up later and extract her teeth. He has this myopic need for her teeth. And when you think about the kind of torture that would have been for her, that is absolutely body horror. So we don't know what happens next. Now, that's kind of another part of the story is, does he get his just, desserts? Does she get her revenge? That's part of the story we unfortunately don't get to hear. But this was actually one of Poe's most absolutely hated stories. This is one of his stories that's most controversial of everything he ever wrote. Because of that aspect, it's pure body horror. Most of his stories do have a vengeance aspect, where the people who are mistreated in his stories get their, revenge, and the people who perform the mistreatment get their just desserts. So let's go to one of those stories and we'll see the difference. Hop Frog. It's another one that is not very commonly taught or read, but it has that kind of the aspect of vengeance to it that makes it a little more palatable to us. We don't like body horror without people getting, comeuppance for it. So Hop Frog is another really, really short story, and to kind of modern sensibilities, it's a really racist one. It's a story that hopefully made you uncomfortable as you're reading this description of poor old Hop Frog. They use language in the story that is not what we would consider acceptable in modern society. The king is described as just this, joker, right? He's just this guy who takes jokes too far. He doesn't know when to stop, but ultimately he's just after a good time. And so he has these two little people in his court, and one of them he calls Hop Frog. They refer to him as a fool. But of course, the whole point of a jester or a fool is that they are the person in court who's supposed to be able to speak truth to power. That's the purpose of a jester. They're supposed to be able to tell the king when they're doing something very wrong or foolish. That's where the term fool comes from. They're about to make a huge mistake, and they're supposed to be able to get away with it. So they're a counselor, in other words. They're supposed to be able to do that. But in this case, Hop Frog's not treated that way. He's treated as, just an object of derision. He's supposed to be someone who's just to be made fun of. And he's treated absolutely horribly. So they refer to him as a dwarf and a cripple, which again, language that would not be acceptable in modern literature. Many monarchs would have found it difficult to get through their days without both a jester to laugh with and a dwarf to laugh at. But they go on to say that Hot Frog is both of these. Hot Frog was not given to the dwarf by his sponsors at baptism, but it was conferred upon him, the name, by general consent because of his inability to walk as other men do. Because he doesn't walk the way other people do because of the way he's built. And they make fun of him for that. They make fun of him because of the way he's built. They make fun of him because he has kind of a protruding stomach. He has a protruding forehead. Although Hop Frog, through the distortion of his legs, could move only with great pain and difficulty along a road or floor, the prodigious muscular power which nature seemed to have bestowed upon his arms by way of compensation enabled him to perform many feats of wonderful dexterity, where ropes or trees were in question, or anything else to climb. So again, we have, he has these, kind of deformities, but he has some things that are going to make up for it. And remember, an author is not going to give you a detail that's not going to come into play later. So they're kind of ignoring this prodigious strength at their peril, as we, of course, find out at the end. We find out that they are slaves. They've been stolen at Trippetta and Hot Frog. And Trippetta is a different kind of dwarf. She's just a small but proportional human. Whereas Hot Frog has the kind of dwarfism that gives him different proportions than other humans. And of course, they get along well, and she does not like the way that he's mistreated. And he's mistreated absolutely brutally. I mean, he's made the butt of jokes. He's physically abused. And all of these count as body horror. But what he does to the king later is both body horror and vengeance. The body horror that is perpetuated upon Hot Frog is pretty light. It's other horrors that are much worse. He is enslaved, which is absolutely a horror. He's treated badly, which is a horror. But his actual physical person is generally left intact. They don't do anything to invade his body. They don't take consent away from him in terms of his actual physical body. But he does that to them. So he gets really the strongest vengeance he possibly can upon them, because he takes vengeance upon their bodies. He says, if you're going to attack my body, or you're going to attack me because of my body, then I'm going to attack your body as well. So if we think about what he actually does in this story to get vengeance, he comes at them the one way that he can, that he knows they can never break free of. Because he's not just going to take money from them or goods or something that they can just replace. Because again, he's the king, and who would that ultimately hurt is the citizens of his kingdom, because they're the ones who would ultimately have to pay for it through taxes and what have you. He can't hurt his pride. He can't hurt his reputation, because who is he? He's just this lower ranking member of the court. He's not, any sort of high ranking person. So he can't come after his pride or his reputation. He can't just, attack him at random, kill him in the middle of the night or anything like that. What he has to do is come after their body, because remember, it's his body that is the basis of what he has gone through. So that is why he chooses the method that he chooses. He's also playing on his own strengths, that ability he has to climb that they have overlooked. And so at the end of the story, when he enacts his vengeance, where he has them dressed up in this ridiculous costume, the orangutan costume, and he has them covered in pitch and set on fire and what have you, he is attacking their physical body in a way it's really, one, the only way available to him to enact vengeance, but two, creates a horrible spectacle for everybody involved, who presumably witnessed his own mistreatment and didn't do anything to intervene. So now they have to watch this. So again, that imprints. In effect, it spreads the body horror to every person who witnesses it. They have to watch it, and experience it just by virtue of being there. But also, it's a body horror enacted upon the counselors and the king. They physically have to feel themselves burning alive while they're suspended from the ceiling and can't do anything to escape. So this is an instance that we see Poe using body horror as a method of vengeance against people who use the body as essentially a weapon. The Black Cat is a vengeance story. It gets a little bit into body horror as well, especially involving the cat and the eye. A lot of students struggle with this story because they don't like mistreatment of animals, which I totally get. I have a lot of students who get angry with me for assigning the story. I understand that completely. Sorry. I don't like reading about mistreatment of animals either. But again, in this story, we have a person who's a victim of body horror, in this case, a cat, who's a victim of body horror, who takes vengeance because of that body horror. I like to say the moral of this story is if you have a cat who's named after the god of death, you should maybe not, victimize it. To me, that's pretty common sense, but apparently it's not common sense to everybody. So in the Black Cat, we have this guy who's generally a pretty nice guy, but he gets worse and worse as he gets older. And his disposition, he says, changes. And then he has Pluto the cat. Of course, our narrator blames his dispositional change on alcohol, which, could happen. Of course, temperance novels were very popular among the time Poe was writing. You had a lot of people who were writing novels about the evils of alcohol and drink. Pretty ironic, given what we know about Poe and his own alcoholism. But, that is what it is. And so he says he came home, he was really, really drunk, and he fancied that the cat avoided my presence. I seized him when in his fright at my violence, he inflicted a slight wound upon my hand with his teeth. The fury of a demon instantly possessed me. So he's blaming possession. We know better. Obviously, this seems to be like it's being told to a jailer or something, the story before his execution. My original soul at once seemed to take flight from its body, and a more than fiendish malevolence, gin-nurtured, thrilled every fiber of my frame. I took from my waistcoat pocket a penknife, opened it, grasped the poor beast by the throat, and deliberately cut one of its eyes from the socket. And again, the guy's like, oh, I feel awful. It was a damnable atrocity. I currently shudder. I can't believe I did that. It was the alcohol. But again, that's body horror. And a lot of you probably recoiled or shuddered or just couldn't handle this particular part of the story. A lot of students really, really hate it. Reading this graphic description of this man cutting a cat's eye out because it bit him. Very deservedly so. That's horrific. And again, with a lot of body horror, that's not something you get back. You can't grow your eye back. The cat, it says it slowly recovers, but it's scared of him forever, as you would be. And he felt guilty about it, but not guilty enough, because he's drunk and his soul's empty and what have you. One morning in cold blood, I slipped a noose about its neck and hung it to the limb of a tree. Hung it with the tears streaming from my eyes, and with the bitterest remorse at my heart, hung it because I knew that it had loved me, and because I felt it had given me no reason of offense. Hung it because I knew that in so doing I was committing a sin, a deadly sin that would so jeopardize my immortal soul as to place it, if such a thing were possible, even beyond the reach of the infinite mercy of the most merciful and most terrible God. So we have this kind of weird conversation that he's having here. The hanging in and of itself doesn't count as body horror. It's just murder. Not all murder is body horror. And I know that's a little bit hard to kind of wrap your head around because you think, well, violation is violation, right? But violation that you have to live with is body horror. The fact that you die as a result of murder is incidental. And it doesn't count as body horror. If that makes sense. I know that's a little bit hard to wrap your mind around. But what you end up having here, you end up having a guy, he commits the body horror by cutting out the eye. The murder is something that he does that doesn't count as body horror because the cat does not have to live with he doesn't have to live with the effects of it forever. Obviously, the murder stops his life. So there is no horror no psychological horror he has to live with forever. And that's kind of a key component of body horror is the psychological part of it. it's not just that you have this thing that is done to you, it's that you have to live with the aftermath of it. You have to live with that trauma, PTSD, you know, of what happened for a long time. And of course, Cat can't because Cat's dead. Although we do have the spectral cat that comes back. Now, whether it's Pluto come back for vengeance or not, is kind of up for you guys to decide. Now, obviously, our particular narrator believes that it's Pluto come back for vengeance, and it causes him to do all kinds of awful things, you know, up to and including additional murders, which lead to his, you know, hanging, ultimately. But body horror is one of those things that's very basic. It kind of took off in the 70s and 80s in terms of, you know, being very popular among the horror, particularly in terms of how graphic it gets. Eli Roth comes to mind. But what you do find is that body horror in and of itself often is a means to an end. You see it used a lot of times to justify kind of vengeance tales. A lot of times it is used as a method of vengeance because really that's about as hard as you can go. You can kill somebody and that's one thing, but if you can intrude on their actual physical bodies, I mean, that's the last boundary that there is. So hopefully that helps you understand our post stories. We're going to do another little video to talk about the Hawthorne story.